The manor's lanterns never truly went out. Even in the blackest hour before dawn, a faint glow still seeped from its windows, like the house itself refused to sleep. Those who worked its endless fields whispered that the light wasn't flame at all, but watchfulness. That even the shadows obeyed her, Lady Varella. The mistress of the manor. She was the kind of woman whose silence could still make a room tremble. Her steps were soft, but her gaze could stop a storm. The air changed when she entered, as if the world bowed slightly. Remembering it was small. The manor had stood for generations, carved from gray stone and pride. Its corridors smelled of wax, old lilac, and the faint echo of secrets. The servants rose before sunrise, moving through their routines like ghosts dressed in linen. Their days were measured not by clocks but by her footsteps. And among them was Elias. He had worked in the lower quarters since boyhood, though no one remembered when he first arrived. His hands were calloused from endless seasons of harvest, yet his eyes, dark, quiet eyes, held something that had not yet broken. He spoke little, but when he did, his words came like a whisper from the earth itself, measured, patient, and carrying weight. That morning, as the fog lifted from the fields, Elias paused near the main path. The manor towered above him, a monument to obedience. The sky hung low, heavy with the kind of silence that predicts storms. He looked up and thought, even the wind moves freely. Why not us? Inside, Lady Varella stood by the great fireplace, her daughters seated behind her, Sarah and Leon, fair and trembling as if made of wax. The mistress' hands rested on the mantle where flames danced without warmth. The world beyond these gates, she said, her voice smooth and cold, is chaos. But here there is order. And order, my children, is a gift that must be kept pure. Her daughters nodded without a sound. From the corner of the room, Elias waited, head bowed. He had been called to deliver a tray, but something in her tone made him linger. Varella turned her eyes to him, sharp, knowing. You've grown strong, Elias. Strength should serve legacy, not pride. Tomorrow you will stand before the family as an example. He did not ask what she meant. He simply lowered his gaze, though a pulse of unease throbbed in his chest. Her words were like chains disguised as praise. That night the manor glowed again, its windows alive with pale fire. In the servant quarters the air felt heavy. No one slept easily. Somewhere above them, laughter floated down the stairwell, thin, hollow, forced, and in that laughter, Elias heard a truth he could not yet name. The house itself was preparing for something cruel, disguised as tradition. Outside, the moon hid behind clouds, and the lanterns flickered as if trying to look away. The light in the manor burned steady, but the shadows have begun to remember they once belonged to the dark. They called it a wedding, but even the sun refused to bear witness. It hid behind bruised clouds that morning, leaving the manor draped in a pale, unnatural light, the color of ash before rain. The courtyard had been dressed in ribbons and roses, but the petals were wilted, their perfume sickly sweet. As if mourning before the vows were spoken, the mistress, Lady Varella, stood at the head of the gathering, framed by her towering daughters and her servants lined in trembling rows. A violin played in the distance off-key, hollow, yet determined to sound like joy. Elias stood still, his back straight, his heart beating too loudly for a day that promised silence. He wore a linen coat, clean, pressed, borrowed, but it felt more like armor than attire. Across from him, Sarah, the younger daughter, looked pale and frightened. Her eyes flicked up for a moment, meeting his, and something unspoken passed between them, fear recognizing itself. Varella's voice broke the still air. Before heaven and hearth, she said, we bind not only hearts but houses. Through unity we preserve obedience. Through obedience we preserve peace. Each word was measured, each syllable a thread in her invisible net. The servants around her bowed their heads, afraid even to breathe. Elias tried to swallow, but his throat was dry. He could hear the crackling of the candles, the whisper of lace brushing the stones, the faint shiver of chains that no one could see, a priest-like figure, an old man whose eyes had long since learned not to look too closely read from a worn book. His voice trembled. Do you, Elias, pledge to serve the house and through this union serve its legacy? Elias hesitated. Just for a breath. then nodded. I do. It wasn't a vow. It was surrender spoken softly enough to sound holy. Sarah's turn came next. Her lips parted, but no sound came. The mistress's hand landed on her shoulder, firm as stone. Speak, child, she said. Sarah's voice broke like thin glass. I do, the violin cried louder. The onlookers clapped softly, as if terrified to make noise. Above them, dark clouds began to roll across the sky. Whispering their disapproval as the ceremony ended, Lady Varela lifted her hands, blessing her creation, a house now doubly bound by will and fear. The wind moved through the courtyard, scattering rose petals like ashes. Sarah's veil fluttered against Elias's hand. For a fleeting moment, her fingers brushed his. It was accidental, too brief to mean anything to anyone watching, but in that instant, something alive sparked beneath the ruin of ritual. Varela turned toward them, smiling a smile that never touched her eyes. A new chapter begins, she said. Elias looked past her to the horizon beyond the manor's gates, where distant thunder rolled like a promise yet unfulfilled. He thought of the fog that morning, how it had tried to swallow the house whole. He wished it had succeeded. The violin falls silent, the last note trembling in the air like a cry smothered beneath the weight of ceremony. Night fell like a closing hand. The manor's corridors quieted one by one until only the creak of old wood and the hush of the wind remained. But beneath the floors, where the air was thin and the walls wept from age, life did not sleep. The servant quarters lay beneath the main hollow labyrinth of narrow chambers and stone passages, dimly lit by a few trembling candles. Here, words could not be spoken loudly. They had to be breathed. And in that breath lived the small, flickering embers of defiance. Elias sat near the far wall, his back against the damp stone, eyes fixed on the flame of a single candle. The ceremony had ended hours ago, but the echo of it still pulsed behind his ribs. The scent of dying roses still clung to his skin. He could still hear the hollow applause, the mockery of it all. He whispered, mostly to himself. They called it union, but it felt like burial. From the shadowed corner, an older servant named Marin spoke softly. Careful, Elias, even the walls here have ears. Elias turned his head. Then let them listen. Let them know silence can bite. Marin's eyes flickered with a wary kind of admiration. Words are dangerous tools in this house. Then I'll use them like fire, Elias said, voice low. A soft rustling came from above, footsteps, slow and deliberate. The mistress moving through her halls again, inspecting her kingdom even in darkness. Every sound of her heels was a command. The servants froze until the noise passed. When it was gone, they began to whisper again. One woman, barely older than a child, leaned close. You saw the mistress smile today? It wasn't for joy. It was for power. She thinks she owns the air we breathe, said another. Elias listened, silent for a while. Then, almost without thinking, he reached for a loose plank beneath him and lifted it slightly. Beneath it, the earth was cool and soft. From his pocket, he drew a scrap of old parchment and a stub of charcoal. He began to write. Not names, those were too dangerous. Not prayers, he no longer believed in gods that looked upon this place. Just thoughts, promises, fragments of freedom written in secret. Marin leaned over his shoulder. What are you writing? He smiled faintly. A story the floor will remember when we're gone. When he finished, he slid the note beneath the plank, pressing it down gently until it disappeared from sight above them. The wind began to hum against the windows. It sounded almost like a voice. The candlelight flickered, stretching shadows across the walls. And for a moment the whole room looked alive, breathing, waiting. Elias closed his eyes, hearing Sarah's voice in memory. If we speak too loud, she will hear the cracks. He whispered back into the dark. Then let the cracks sing. The candle burns low, its flame trembling like a secret on the verge of being spoken. Morning came like a ghost, pale, reluctant, and cold. Mist curled low over the fields, wrapping the earth in silence. The manor's bell rang thrice, slow and hollow, summoning everyone to the gardens where Lady Varela tended her Layla to outsiders. The garden was beauty itself, a place of color and fragrance where everything seemed alive. but those who worked it knew better. The soil here was too dark, too rich. It drank water greedily, as though it had once learned to feed on more than rain. Elias walked through the rows of white lilac, each flower perfect, symmetrical, and utterly lifeless. The mistress demanded they bloom all year, defying nature as easily as she defied compassion. Lady Varella stood among them, gloved hands clasped behind her back. Her daughters followed, silent shadows in pale dresses. She spoke as Elias knelt to work, her voice carrying over the rustle of leaves. "Do you see how they grow, Elias? Not one dares to lean the wrong way. That is discipline." He bowed his head. "Yes, my lady. Each root knows its place. Each petal obeys the sun's command." She turned slightly, the morning light catching her jeweled hairpin. "Disobedience is a weed, and weeds must be cut before they spread." Elias's hands stilled in the soil. Beneath his fingertips he could feel the cold bones of the earth. He wondered if the lilac roots tangled around forgotten things. A soft voice broke through his thoughts, Sarah's. "Mother, the lilac are too still. They don't move in the breeze." Varella turned sharply. "Because they are strong, child. Weak things tremble at the touch of wind." Sarah lowered her gaze, her face pale in the sunlight. Elias glanced up just once, catching her eyes. There was sorrow there, something deeper than fear. Something that wanted to speak but could not. When the mistress moved on, Elias whispered beneath his breath, "Even strong things break when they forget how to bend." Sarah heard him. She didn't look his way, but her lips curved just barely, like a secret smile hidden under grief. Varella paused ahead, turning her gaze to the sky. "Storms are coming," she said softly. "They test what deserves to stand." A crow landed on the garden's stone wall, black feathers gleaming against the white lilac. It caught once a sharp, cutting sound that made Varella flinch. She glared at the bird as though it had spoken a forbidden truth. "Crows gather when something begins to rot," she murmured. Elias watched her walk away, her gown brushing against the lilac. The flowers swayed after her like mourners. When she disappeared into the house, Sarah lingered. For the first time, she spoke to him without whispering. "Do you ever wonder," she said, "if the lilac know they are trapped?" Elias looked at the garden, so beautiful, so still. "They know," he said quietly. "But they bloom anyway. It's the only rebellion left to them. A petal falls, landing in the soil like a quiet surrender, and the crow's cry echoes over the manor, lonely, defiant, unending." The east wing was silent, except for the faint hum of breath behind glass. They called it the mirror room, a place Lady Varella visited when she wished to speak only to herself. It was said she collected mirrors from across the land's oval, square, gilded, cracked, each one rumored to have belonged to a different story, a different soul. And in their reflections, she believed she could see truth or control it. Elias was ordered to polish them each morning before sunrise. No one else was allowed inside. The air there felt different, too clean, too still, like a room holding its breath. The mirrors lined every wall, reflecting the dim candlelight into endless versions of the same empty space. As he wiped each surface, Elias saw himself multiplied 100-fold. 1,000 faces staring back, each one a little older, a little more hollow. He thought of the garden, obedient, perfect, unmoving, and wondered if he was just another reflection, kept alive to mimic peace. When the door opened, Lady Varella stepped in, her gown trailing behind her like fog. She didn't acknowledge him at first. Instead, she moved slowly from mirror to mirror, her gloved fingers brushing against their cold surfaces. "Do you know why I keep these?" she asked at last, her voice low but edged with something brittle. Elias kept his gaze lowered. "To see yourself, my lady." She smiled faintly, her reflection splintering into 100 duplicates that smiled with her. "No, to remind myself that even light must obey." Elias hesitated. "And what if the reflection refuses?" Her eyes flicked to him, sharp as glass. "Then the mirror is broken." He nodded, returning to his work. But as he moved, he noticed something strange, tiny cracks spider-webbing through several of the mirrors. They hadn't been there before. Or perhaps they had, hidden until the light revealed them. Varela turned toward one of the larger mirrors, a tall, arched frame that seemed to breathe when she stood before it. "When my daughters were young," she said softly, almost tenderly, "they would look into these mirrors and imagine lives beyond these walls. I made them stop. Too much reflection breeds desire, and desire breeds rebellion." Her voice lingered like a chill. Elias paused his hand mid-wipe, catching her reflection beside his own. For a moment he saw not a woman of power, but a figure hollowed by her own control, haunted by the fear of losing it. He spoke quietly, not to her, but to the glass. "Even mirrors tire of showing the same face?" Varela stiffened. "What was that?" "Nothing, my lady." She studied him a long moment, then turned and left without another word. The door closed, echoing like a final command. Elias stood alone, surrounded by the endless versions of himself. His reflection stared back from every direction, some weary, some angry, one almost smiling, and as he watched, one of the mirrors small, forgotten. Leaning in the corner, cracked without being touched, a single shard slips from the frame and falls to the floor, catching the candlelight as it breaks a silent gleam of rebellion, sharp enough to remember pain. Night fell heavy over the manor, too quiet, too complete. Even the wind seemed afraid to pass through its gates. The air hung thick with the scent of rain and something else, expectation. The kind that hums in the chest before a storm, decides whether it will cleanse or destroy. In every corridor, candles burned low, trembling like hearts that had waited too long in silence. The servants had retired to their quarters, the daughters to their rooms, and Lady Varela to her chair beside the great hearth, where she often sat in half-dream, half-command. But this night, something changed. A sound, soft, uneven, out of place. It came first from the east hall, then from the west, then from everywhere at once. The small brass bells that hung beside every servant's door began to tremble, ringing faintly without being touched. Each one gave a different tone, a fragile, frightened chime. It was not loud enough to wake the mistress, yet loud enough to be heard by those who were meant to hear it. Elias rose from his cot, eyes wide, heart steady. The bell beside his bed swung gently as if stirred by breath. He reached out and stilled it with his fingers, but the ringing continued from elsewhere. A chain of soft voices calling in secret. He stepped into the corridor. Others emerged too: Marin, the young kitchen girl, two of the older men from the stables. All looked at one another, eyes reflecting candlelight like the eyes of hunted things learning what it feels like to stop running. "What is it?" Someone whispered. Elias didn't answer. He only listened. The bells were speaking, and for the first time he could understand their language. It was not warning, it was awakening. Upstairs, thunder rolled. The long-promised storm had come. Rain began to fall, slow at first, then fierce. The roof groaned, the windows shuddered, and the house itself seemed to breathe for the first time in years. Elias walked to the main hall. He knew Lady Varela would be there. She always slept by the fire. The doors creaked as he pushed them open. She was indeed there, sitting upright in her chair, a glass of untouched wine beside her, her reflection mirrored in the dozen panels of glass that lined the walls. The firelight painted her face gold and shadow, as if she were carved from both pride and fear. For a moment Elias only watched her. The woman who had bound their lives with silence now looked small, fragile, even dwarfed by her own house. Outside, lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the courtyard. The rain pooled on the stones, forming shallow mirrors that reflected the glow of the house. In those mirrors, the servants saw themselves not as servants, but as people standing upright for the first time. Sarah appeared at the stairway, her white nightdress ghost-like in the darkness. She looked at Elias, then out toward the courtyard. "If tomorrow looks like this," she said softly, "I can live in it." Elias nodded. The bells stopped ringing. The house fell silent again, but the silence was different now. It wasn't submission. It was readiness. Thunder rolled once more, deep and long, as if the sky itself was applauding those who had finally remembered they were free to make noise. Midnight surrendered slowly to dawn, though the sky above the manor bled gray rather than gold. It was the kind of morning that felt caught between life and memory, too pale to be night, too wounded to be day. The air was damp with rain, the earth soaked, and the manor's once proud windows looked clouded. As if they too had been crying in silence, Elias stood beneath the great oak near the courtyard, the same tree that had watched generations come and go in servitude. Its roots spread like buried voices beneath the soil, patient and knowing. He pressed his hand to the trunk, feeling the thrum of water dripping through its bark. It reminded him of a heartbeat slow, steady, awakening dot behind him. The others gathered. The servants, the daughters, even the old caretaker whose eyes had seen too much. No one spoke, yet every face carried the same realization. The night had not broken them. It had broken something else. Something far older. The manor doors creaked open. Lady Varella appeared on the threshold, still wrapped in her night cloak, her hair unpinned for the first time. She looked out upon the group with confusion, then with a quiet fury that trembled just beneath her calm. "What are you doing out here?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the damp morning dot. No one answered. The silence stretched, deep and deliberate. The very sound of it felt dangerous, as though words themselves had become unnecessary. Elias stepped forward. His hands were empty, his eyes steady. "The house is yours, my lady," he said softly. "But the morning is ours." Her expression faltered. "What does that mean?" "It means," said Maren, stepping beside Elias, "that we remember who we are." The words struck her like cold air. Varella's gaze darted from one face to another, searching for weakness, for the old obedience. But there was none left. What she found instead was quiet strength, a defiance so calm it could not be punished. "You forget yourselves," she hissed, clutching the edges of her cloak. "You belong here." Elias looked at her for a long time, his voice barely above a whisper. "We belong to silence." "Not anymore?" Varella's face paled. For the first time, she seemed to understand what true isolation meant, not the absence of company, but the absence of control. Her reflection in the rain-soaked stones wavered, fragmented by ripples, fading into shapes that no longer resembled her. Lightning flickered far beyond the hills. The oak groaned softly in the wind. Elias turned away from the house, and one by one the others followed. Their steps were slow but certain, their shadows stretching long in the dim light. None looked back behind them. The manor stood silent, its fire gone cold, its mirrors dark. Its mistress alone with her echo, and as dawn finally broke, it did not rise over masters or servants, but over the quiet faces of those who had chosen to stand. The light did not ask who they were, it simply touched them as if to say, "You have endured the night." The manor stood hollow beneath the pale morning sky, its windows empty, its hearth extinguished. The storm had passed, leaving behind a hush so deep it felt sacred. Even the crows perched on the iron gates seemed uncertain whether to sing or mourn. The air was heavy with the scent of wet soil and burnt candlewick, the fragrance of endings. Inside, Lady Varella wandered through her halls barefoot, her steps whispering against the marble. The silence followed her like a shadow she could not outrun. Every mirror she passed was cracked now, their reflections splintered into fragments that refused to recognize her. She stopped before the grand one in the mirror room, the tallest, once her favorite. Now its surface rippled faintly, distorted by the web of fractures running across it. For years she had demanded perfection from everything that lived beneath her roof. Now even her reflection denied her that illusion. "Why do you stare at me?" she whispered, pressing a trembling hand against the glass. "Do you mock me too?" But the mirrors did not answer. They only showed her what remained, a woman surrounded by the ghosts of her own control, haunted not by rebellion but by the silence that had replaced it. Beyond the manor walls, the sound of life stirred. Distant laughter, the creak of wagons, the low hum of people speaking to one another freely. It was faint, but it grew with every passing moment like morning light pushing through the mist. Elias stood on the far hill, the rising sun casting gold across his shoulders. The others had already begun their walk toward the forest's edge, where the mist curled low like smoke from a dying fire. He lingered for a moment, looking back at the manor. It was no longer a prison, only a shell. For a long time he said nothing. Then, quietly, He spoke not to the house, but to the memory of it. You fed on silence, he said. Now may silence feed on you. He turned to follow the others. His boots sank slightly in the soft earth, the soil rich with rain and ash. The world beyond the gates waited untamed, uncertain, but real behind him. A gust of wind swept through the broken windows. It carried with it the faintest sound, the echo of those hidden bells that had once called the servants to obedience. Now they rang of their own accord, faint but defiant, their tones drifting into the morning air. Inside the mirror room, one final crack split across the grand glass, running from corner to corner like a scar closing. The mirror did not shatter, it simply fractured enough to let the light through. Lady Varela sank to her knees before it, watching the morning sun pour through the break. Her reflection blurred, fading into brightness. And in that broken light, justice took no shape, spoke no word, and sought no vengeance. It simply existed, quiet, patient, eternal, like the dawn that forgets the night but never forgives it. The garden had always been the quiet heart of the manor, its only honest place. It was where secrets had been buried, tears had been swallowed, and dreams had been pruned before they could bloom. Now, in the fragile days after the storm, it breathed differently. The soil had darkened, the air smelled of wet roots and freedom, and the lila that once bowed in obedience stood taller, their pale heads turned toward the sun. Elias returned there at dawn. He had not meant to, his feet simply carried him. The others had gone to the valley beyond, to find new ground and build something of their own. But Elias lingered. Drawn by a pull he could neither name nor ignore, the garden greeted him with silence, not the fearful kind that once choked the air, but a softer silence, the kind that listens. Every leaf seemed alive, trembling slightly, heavy with dew. The world was still damp from the storm, and the faint mist that clung to the hedges gave the garden a dreamlike sheen. He walked the familiar path, his fingers brushing the petals that had survived the rain. They were bruised but unbroken, their beauty made strange by struggle. He knelt beside one of the small marble fountains, its basin cracked, its water muddy, and remembered the first time he had seen it. The day he was brought here, still young, still believing silence could protect him. He spoke softly, as if to the flowers. You saw it all, didn't you? The years of shadows, the hands that commanded, the voices that never rose. A breeze moved through the garden, then stirring the branches. It almost sounded like an answer. He closed his eyes and let the wind touch his face. For the first time, he did not feel afraid of remembering. Memory was not a chain, it was proof that he had survived. Somewhere behind him, the manor loomed, stripped of its grandeur. Its windows were blind, its mirrors dark, its master gone. Yet here, in the garden, life had returned. He picked up a single lily, broken at the stem, and placed it into the cracked basin. The water rippled, catching the early sunlight. The reflection that looked back at him was no longer the boy who had entered these walls, but the man who had learned that even the smallest act of defiance could bloom into something eternal. He turned toward the gate and took one last look at the manor, a house that had once devoured names, dreams, and dignity. Now it was only stone and wood, hollow and waiting to be forgotten. As he stepped through the garden gate, the wind swept again through the lilac, making them sway in perfect, soundless unison like a quiet bow of farewell. And as Elias walked into the open fields beyond, the morning sun caught the dew on the petals, turning every drop into light. The garden, once silent in fear, now whispered in freedom, a language only the free could hear. The hill overlooked the manor, but it no longer held the weight it once did. Its towers and windows were mere shapes in the morning haze, stripped of authority, hollowed by time and the storm. Elias sat on the grass, the wind tangling his hair, carrying the scent of wet earth and freedom. In his hands rested a folded letter, edges softened by repeated handling, a confession, a release, a whisper to someone who would never read it. He hesitated before unfolding the parchment. His ink had smudged slightly, but the words remained legible, sharp enough to cut the memory into something permanent. You taught us silence. We turned it into a song? Simple, true, enough. He had begun writing it weeks ago. In stolen moments beneath floorboards, in the shadows of gardens, beneath the faint light of candles that trembled like hearts. At first, the letter had been a cry of anger, then of sorrow, and finally of understanding. Elias read it once more, lips moving with a gentle cadence, almost like prayer. This was not a challenge, nor a plea for acknowledgement. It was proof that they had survived, that they had reclaimed themselves from the grasp of fear. The hill was empty, save for the rising sun casting a pale glow across the valley. Sarah joined him, stepping lightly, her presence calm but unmistakable. She placed a hand on his shoulder, the touch speaking more than words could. "They'll never read it," she said softly. "No," Elias agreed, folding the letter again. "But they don't need to. It's not for them. It's for us." She nodded, and together they walked to the edge of the hill. Below, the manor shrank into insignificance, a monument to power that had forgotten mercy. The wind picked up, carrying their footsteps, their breaths, their resolve, scattering them across the fields like seeds. Elias knelt to place the letter beneath a smooth stone. It was a small act, almost ceremonial. The weight of it pressed lightly against the earth, and for a moment he imagined it taking root, growing into something that could never be uprooted: memory, truth, liberation. He stood and watched the horizon stretch endlessly. The others were already moving forward, their silhouettes stepping into the unknown, into open skies and untamed lands. The wind whispered around them, carrying the faint echoes of what had been, and the promise of what could be. For a moment, Elias felt the shadows of the past brush against him, familiar and unwelcome, yet diminished. They were no longer chains, they were reminders of resilience, of the quiet courage it had taken to walk away. The manor remained behind, silent, empty, a place of echoes and reflection. But the world ahead was alive, vast, and waiting. And in that waiting, Elias felt something he had never known before: the gentle, unshakable certainty that freedom was not an act but a journey, and they had finally begun it. He left the letter beneath the stone, letting the wind lift over it, carrying with it all the silences that had once bound them into a sky that would never demand obedience again.